I'm going to share the screen and just kind of talk about, since no one's going to the Effect meetup in New York because you are in different places all over the world, which is great, then I can vaguely talk about what I'm planning on, what I'm still working on, I guess. So let me share a screen. Cool, yeah, so I'm just going to ramble a little bit. Let me know if this makes sense to anyone. Oh man, people are laying on their horn outside. But as I mentioned before, I'm relatively new to Effect, though I have a weird background because I worked on the library that Effect is based on. So I somehow know a lot about Effect, but I have strange gaps in my knowledge when it comes to TypeScript, including getting started with just like new repositories, especially with all the build tooling and tsconfig. I'm slowly figuring it out and building some, I guess, patterns for myself. But it's a lot to get started, and then I can only imagine all the people who don't really know Effect. Maybe they have the mirror of my situation, where they know how to make TypeScript projects, but they don't know what the heck Effect's about. I know Michael Arnaldi has been exploring some AI-related tooling. Hey, Fafi, welcome. I think Maxwell will be here in a minute, and we can start answering some questions. But in the meantime, I'm just going to sort of ramble and discuss what I'm planning on presenting at the Effect New York City meetup tonight. So yeah, I want to make it, if you've been on the internet and you've read feedback for Effect, I think the most, the perennial complaint is documentation. Maybe that's for all libraries ever. Oh, good. Hey, Maxwell.
Hello.
How's it going?
I probably won't be able to show video today because the internet in my neighborhood is out. So I'm on my phone's 5G connection currently.
Amazing. Okay. Well, that's no worries. Can you see video?
Yeah, it's just choppy, but I can see.
Okay. I don't think there's going to be any crazy animation. Well, if that's too much and it's too weird, like you can feel free to drop off or what have you. But if you do want to stick around, okay. Well, then I'll recap for you what I was planning on talking about until we got any questions. Well, there is actually one question, so I'll look at that in a moment. But because everyone here is in Iran or Europe or elsewhere and not in New York City, and therefore won't be going to the meetup tonight, I can kill multiple birds with one stone and sort of talk about what I'm planning on sort of presenting this evening in like whatever 15-30 minute slot that we have. And so the problem that I vaguely wanted to approach is well, yeah, I was saying, obviously people complain about the docs. That's, if you go on Twitter, people complain about the docs. I think some of that is perhaps our docs' fault. There are various, reasons. I think our documentation is maybe more of an encyclopedia of Effect, and it goes into a lot of details. And I think it does do a good job of explaining what it explains. But if you're a new person to Effect, which I think is where a lot of people who are making complaints about the docs are coming from, it could be overwhelming to just be handed almost like a language reference. There's something that's so broad, especially for a library that does so much. And I think I'm trying to think of like, okay, how do you tackle teaching people at the beginning, especially in especially now in these different times of AIs, etc., and LLMs, because most people, I'd imagine, these days are using LLMs to get started with the code base, and it could be weird if it's writing code that it might be broken, that you don't understand, that it doesn't understand. It just adds one other layer of complexity. And I know Michael Arnaldi was exploring some things with like, some prompt files. But anyway, my experiment, I guess, to attempt to address this a little bit is the following. So the idea is to have it's called Effect Best Practices here right now. I don't know if I hate that word. And I actually bought the domain name effect.solutions. So that's fun, which is not the current version right now. So that's even worse, Effect Solutions, but I kind of like it. I'll have like a big GeoCities kind of Microsoft Word 3D text that says something like Effect Solutions. But the idea is obviously have a website, sure, some documentation, but have it sort of vigorously scoped down to what is useful for getting started, and not necessarily explaining things here. So there's, like, I feel like we need different kinds of documentation, and I tend to work on various aspects of it. Like, we do need an introductory lesson course for the underlying concepts, sort of what I made a couple of YouTube videos about, but going much more in depth from a beginner's perspective. What is laziness? What are the error types? What is an effect, etc. But then there's like, okay, you have a vague idea of how effect works, and you want to actually use it in an application, and you try to, and you stumble because there are so many ways of doing things, and there's so many libraries you might not even know which ones to use. So sort of a guide at that level could be useful. It could be useful for you, but it could also be useful for the robots. And my thinking so far right now with like what is good for LLMs, I know there's like so much written about this and so much written by LLMs about this, it seems. Anthropic keeps dumping out 5,000 page articles about how to best, do context windows and all these different tricks, and they have MCPs and plugins and skills and whatever. These agents, these LLMs seem to do the best when you treat them like a very simplifying metaphor is just like treat them like another smart engineer on your team. Don't expect them to have, extrasensory perception. Don't expect them to read your mind, just like you wouldn't expect. Like, I couldn't just message Maxwell on Discord and be like, make app good, go do good app for me now. He wouldn't know what the hell I'm talking about. Like, you have to give constraints. But if I have like a very clear image and idea, and I say, hey, Maxwell, can you help me with this problem? Here's what I've looked at. Here's some documentation. I could probably trust Maxwell to search through those docs and figure things out if I constrain it properly and give all the information. So likewise, I think we can make an artifact that is simultaneously good for people and good for LLMs. And so the idea would be just like, okay, some overview. Another thing, it's sort of various things here. Something that is useful in the world are these create apps, right? Like, let me see. There's one called Better T-Stack, right? Better T-Stack, is that the one that I've seen? It's like this crazy TypeScript create app. Create Better T-Stack. Where's this website? Okay, there we go. So this website's crazy. It's kind of cool looking. But it's a create command that will give you a little starter template. But you can sort of pick everything, all of these different axes of configuration. Are you using TanStack or React Router or Expo and whatever? All this combinatoric complexity, which is kind of insane. And it seems like not everything is supported everywhere. Because of course, like I don't know what the actual combination count is here, but combinatoric complexity isn't fun when you have to manually implement it. And in this case, if you're trying to have all these libraries work together, there will be a huge number of possible variations. You just really can't. You'd run out of whatever. And there are probably more ways of configuring TypeScript projects than there are atoms in the universe, etc. So that's a thing. It would be nice to make a create effect app CLI that gave you what you wanted, but effect is a weird tool. It's this library that can help you. It can integrate into other libraries. You might use it with Next.js. You might use it with TanStack Start. You might use it with. You probably wouldn't use it with Hono or whatever. I don't know, but you can integrate it into lots of libraries. So having a starter kit, a thing that just sort of dumps out a project structure might not make sense because you're actually going to be constrained by the project structure of the real framework. Effect isn't quite a framework. It's a substrate. It's the medium of your application. So that's a challenge to write something like that. So I was thinking that was my first goal, like how to even make something like that. And it would have to be a very simple example project that it would dump out and be pretty limited. But when I make experiments these days, I mostly am using Claude Code or Anthropic or Codex or Gemini now. I guess Gemini's the winner of today. And say, hey, I want to build this project, whatever, use Bun, here's a setup, etc. Go look at the docs and things. And it does this, and it's okay. But inevitably, I have to keep copying, pasting, like what Michael has suggested lately, which is a great tip. He, I believe, makes a Git submodule in the project with the effect repository and say, hey, look, if you have any effect questions, look at the effect code base. as a source of truth. It's surprisingly good at that. It's incredibly good at that, which is crazy. I just give it a link to my open source repository where I've already cloned that the effect repo and other repos, and just give it absolute paths to whatever projects you already have cloned, or tell it to clone it, whatever, and it can do that. Like, once again, treating it like a human. People go through all these contortions. Well, I should give it an MCP server or whatever. There are all these now other blogs. I'm sort of regurgitating various things which say like it's just as good at using CLI tools than an MCP server. Because at the end of the day, if you treat it like a human being, ultimately, if you treat it like a smart engineer, it's very good at looking through documentation. What would you do if LLMs didn't exist? You would probably clone the repository and look through the code base, or you would read the docs. The docs are in the code base. It's not so great at necessarily browsing the web sometimes because of all the HTML noise. So having the repository, it can look for markdown files. It can look at the actual code. So with all that being said, what I was thinking as a way of solving this problem, as a proposal, is to have a tool which could double as a website, because this is going to be human readable, sure, and it should be written for humans as well and be a high level, just sort of prescriptive guide. You can ignore its advice, but instead of qualifying every recommendation with 10, 20 variations, give something that's going to sort of satisfy the Pareto principle, work 80% of the time for most cases, and if you're advanced enough, you can deviate from it. First learn the rules, then break the rules, like they say in art class or whatever. But also it's going to be exposed, and I should share another screen, as so far I made it so you can say like bunx effect solutions install, and it will install a Claude skill into your local folder. And all a Claude skill is really, it's a bundle of markdown files. It's like a bundle of docs, and it can also have scripts or whatever that's sort of progressively disclosed to the agent. It sort of gets like a high level list at the top of its context of all the skills it has available, and it says, hey, if you're going to work with Excel documents, you might want to basically open this skill, which will just say, hey, it'll dump a skill.md file into context, which will describe the folder layout of all the other reference material relating to effect or Excel or whatever skill you want to teach it. So this repository has a website. It also exposes itself as a Claude skill and can expose itself in that's a weird way. It can expose itself to many people in many different ways, many different agents in many different ways. I don't know if there's an analog to Claude skills in Codex. I don't think there is, but really it could just, whatever, in that case, just dump the markdown files into some local .context folder or whatever, because really that's what it's good at. And I've been experimenting with this, and it works pretty well, because like what I do every time these days is set up the effect language service, which you might not know how to do this. I'm going to click on the full guide. Here is, of course, in the repository. And it has more text, more information. We don't really need all of this to just get started with it. Really, I follow these instructions at the top. I install it, except with bun, not necessarily npm or whatever. And then down here, I set something else up. So if you don't know what you're doing, you might not know to follow all these steps. So here is a more concise description of it. The other thing that this repository would do is, like, there's always the problem in coding of a single source of truth. Ideally, you have a single source of truth. If you do not have a single source of truth, you get multiple sources of truth, which is an oxymoron, because there is going to be inherent drift between these. So anytime you redundantly, denormalize and copy even something as simple as a README, that's going to possibly cause me pain. I mean, that's kind of the problem with documentation and developers in the first place. Documentation and the actual code are sort of loosely coupled, and therefore will drift inevitably. So to add this other layer of indirection of a document that references a document which references the code, there's more opportunity for drift. So the solution for this, which is hacky, is that there is in this GitHub repo, there's a cron job which runs Claude code. And basically it's given a prompt that says, hey, here are some sources and files. Like for this piece of code here, consult once a day, read the actual primary source of truth, and ensure that we don't have any drift. And, we can make this more clever by hashing the sources or whatever, and only running these prompts when they differ. But like, I'm trying to think of like what in the future is a way to use LLMs to do much more and to work in with these fuzzier constraints and fuzzier boundaries, but try to keep some correctness. And so it's a weird thing, and I don't know if this is going to be useful yet, but I think it will be, because the goal would be to help, like, anybody, a human can read this and understand sort of, okay, here's how to set up a new effect project. I'm going to install the LSP with here are the only commands I care about. And here's a recommended TypeScript configuration that we have. This links to the effect small one. So the GitHub cron job would also look at this and compare this against my recommendations. And if that drifts, it will open an issue on the repository, alerting me to that fact. So yeah, here's the TypeScript config, and it's sort of, once again, it's taking the effect small recommendations and putting them here. Like, this is kind of scattered throughout the world right now, all of these different best practices for effect, and I want to consolidate them. And I want to make sure that they remain correct, and I want to make sure that they're easily consumable by humans and agents. And it's a difficult problem to solve for the reason, like, the other alternative solution would be a CLI tool that just dumps out a project structure for you that has this TS config and has that set up. But 90% of the time, that's not going to be useful because you want to make, you want to use this hot new JavaScript serverless framework, and that it doesn't dump out the right structure up. So I hope that makes sense. And anyway, I'm glad I'm practicing this here before talking about it tonight. The idea, I guess, that I want to talk about tonight is to actually go through some of these best practices with everybody at the meetup, and just get their opinions, because I don't know the best practices or the recommendations that are correct, and I haven't consulted yet with Maxwell or Michael. So I want this to change and be a living document, but I kind of want to sort of build what could be the shell and the infrastructure for something like this. And eventually it could be, of course, moved to the official effect website if that seems useful. And so this would fill one of these sort of 3 levels of documentation that I see being useful, which is a course, a beginner course to actually teach a human, the encyclopedia, which is useful for both humans and LLMs to actually deeply understand all concepts, though I think maybe doc strings are really good for that as well, just in the code. And then this in-between world of, like, you're an intermediate or beginner, you want to use effect, you kind of understand how it works, you're not a master, but you actually want to get stuff done. You don't care about, like, the 27 different ways of using Schema and all of its features. You want to be like, okay, for instance, here, my recommendations, feel free to disagree with me, are TypeScript's data modeling tools are very limited. In other languages, like Scala, I really appreciated how there was sort of just 2 ways of modeling data. And you have, to use a bit of functional programming terminology, you have product types and sum types. What that means is you have types that are composites of values. You think of the word and, like a user is an email and a name and a password or whatever, or and a is alive Boolean flag. And you have all of these 3 things together. And then the dual of this is these sum types, these or types, which is you have this or this. So you have ands and ors. And basically you can model any piece of data in the world by grouping together a bunch of ands or ors. Like a bit, a binary digit is an or between a 0 and a 1. 0 or it's 1. Whereas a byte is an and of 8 bits. Whatever, that's just one simple example. But really, it's a simple orthogonal method for basically designing any useful piece of data that you could possibly define. And TypeScript makes it a little awkward to define these things with. Especially, it's great at product types, sort of, because they're structural types. It can be a little weird. So you sometimes want a nominal type, and effect schema is really great for this. And similarly it has enums, but enums don't have values associated with them. So then you have to use unions, but then you have to have tagged unions. Anyway, there's a few different ways of building these things. And that's kind of the problem already in TypeScript. There's not just like 2 keywords that you can use that solve all of your problems. So Schema, for me, I'm trying to make it the solution to that data modeling, paralysis analysis. So yeah, basically the recommendation here is, like, if you're making a composite data model with multiple fields, use schema.class. So if you're making a user, do this pattern. There, never make an interface for user, just do schema. Obviously, there will be some exceptions. You might have a data type that doesn't fit into a schema. It could be too awkward. You might have performance reasons. Sure. And if you're an expert and you know those exceptions, then ignore this. But for getting started, for 80% of the time, this is a pretty good default because you're going to get a constructor that's very nice and type safe. You're going to also get serialization and deserialization for free. You're going to get nominal type here in user. So if another type has the same structure, you can't pass that in. You'd have to use a user that's been created with user.make. That's just one example. There are also unions for sort of dealing with the that sum type, that or type as well. You can have literals, and then you can have these tagged classes and make unions of them. A little maybe more verbose than you'd want, but if you just pick one way of doing things that solves most of the problems and gives you really nice defaults like serialization, deserialization, of course, matching out of the box. I'm not sure if this is this is actually a question for you, Maxwell, if you're still there, or your connection's okay. Or anyone, if you have opinions as well. Like, I know there are a few different ways of doing matching. There's match.value, and then you can pipe the result here. There's also match tags, where you can sort of give it an object. Maybe there's some nuances to this. Like, if there was one that satisfied the Pareto principle, like, what would you reach for 80% of the time? I guess would be my question that I'll ask tonight. And then, I'll update this. But, yeah, if anyone has any opinions or thoughts having used this, yeah, definitely let me know.
I think the one thing for match that's like useful, which isn't showcased here but could be, is that you can there's a lot of different ways to create matchers, but you can extract a matcher. So like the handle result here, instead of using match.value and then piping that and whatever, you could actually extract the matcher, so it's only like quote unquote compiled once, and use match.type instead of match.value.
Easy.
But yeah, I mean, I think switching over data types is also fine. I think match is just like it's basically just a convenience over switching on stuff. But there are sometimes where like using match is nice, but yeah, like I would recommend using match.type and extracting your matchers, because then you don't build the matcher every time.
Okay, I like that. No, that's perfect. And then that could be here as like the one way of doing things instead of the potentially multiple ways, which are each useful in different scenarios. But like as a default, that solves everything. That would be great. So do you mean perhaps this?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Thanks, AI. Why didn't it auto refresh? So it should really auto refresh. That's my own build tooling problem. Okay. Great. So yeah, that's Max, does that sort of make sense as a goal at all? That what I was rambling about before? It's kind of hard to explain what I'm trying to go for here, but
sorry, I keep having to unmute myself. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that we can work with this type of thing and make it like really nice for both, for like you said, like LLM context, but also as a document for users. But yeah, I think this could be like a really nice way for people to get started with setting up an effect project, and like also like just learning some of like the overarching best practices that we recommend, because I think like a lot of that information right now lives in Discord and it's not easily searchable, so like making it more readily available would be nice.
okay, perfect. Okay, great. That reminds me, I probably want to the repo setup add the MCP effect, the actual effect MCP, which can be useful, as well as maybe that tip that I mentioned. Like, sorry.
One other thing on your schema thing, just because if you're presenting this tonight, I don't want you to say the incorrect thing, but the schema classes are not nominal by default. So you could create a user two that has the identical structure and pass that to a function that accepts a user.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I did not know that. Is there a way to opt into nominality?
Let me share this little playground that I just wrote with everybody. Is there a way to opt into nominality? You would need some sort of like whether it's a brand or a unique field or a tag on the type
Okay.
to make
Okay.
it structurally distinct. Here's an example.
Oh, there's tagged class, right? I could have tagged class, sort of, but that, of course, would be so different.
Yeah, tagged class or a type ID or for simple types, like a brand is fine.
Okay, let me take a look.
I don't know, like if this
Oh,
is.
I see.
Just give it a second to compile.
Make does not. Yeah. There we go. Okay, cool. Yeah, test takes user, but this works as well. Oh yeah, and even though they have different tags, it does. Well, that's not a tag. That's so much.
Yeah, that ID is not actually a tag. It's more for trying to prevent duplicate, like basically duplicate versions of the same schema ending up in the bundle. But if you use a tagged class where you have distinct tags, then yes, you'll end up with a distinct type because everything in TypeScript is structural.
Cool. So if I do something like this and use a tagged class, then user2 is not usable there. Okay, cool. Just because it has a different structure in that case. Okay, cool. Great. Yeah, and I do have some examples for branded types as well, which I like for IDs in particular. That's kind of the recommendation here, that it's useful everywhere. I wouldn't want to just give the recommendation to use a branded type for literally everything, because otherwise, thinking about this for both, LLMs can be a little bit literal sometimes, and you don't want to have like name, email, literally every possible variation of string as a branded type. But I think at least for IDs, if they're all strings or something, is a reasonable default. And then you can opt into using them more when it's useful. I mean, and when it's useful is when you don't want to transpose, mistranspose, misuse the different. If everything's stringly typed, you can easily pass a post ID to a user ID accepting method, and that's not going to raise a compilation error. Instead, it's just going to blow up in a very strange way. So yeah, you can pipe in these schema.brands, which I like as a pattern.
Yeah, branded schemas are goated for sure. I think in a code base where you're building up like a domain for your like application, I personally would recommend that any primitive type be branded if it makes sense to brand. Really, like any primitive type I would brand if I was building out a domain for a particular like API or application I was like working on.
I mean, yeah, I think that makes sense. There's no reason, there's a semantic reason for a particular string, and if you want that to be distinguishable at the type level, then you have to brand it. You never want a username to be used for a movie title, so why not have username and movie title as branded types? Yeah, maybe I should expand that recommendation. For the branded types section, expand your recommendation to say basically all primitives should be branded types if you want to build a nice, beautiful domain world. Cool. I told the LLMs to make that change. We'll see what it does. By the way, shameless plug for my free transcription software, hex.kitlangton.com. It's pretty good, and you can just hold an option key and it will type for you. As an example, I'm going to hold the option key and say, "Hello, Maxwell. How are you doing today? Do you want to go and buy some balloons with me before the effect meetup, and we can just walk through the park together?" Look at that! It went almost immediately, which is pretty crazy.
Only if the balloons have Mike's face on them.
Of course, hand painted by park artists, park caricaturists.
We'll get Nano Banana to generate a nice face for Mike and then put it on a balloon.
Yeah, let's get him a new face, a nano banana face. Oh, there was a question. Does it have to be a redacted branded type? Wait, does it work to have a redacted branded type? I think so. Oh, I see. I think they're composable either way. I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head. I'd imagine it's fully.
They're composable either way, I believe. I think, but yeah, I think like this is one of those situations where like it depends. I think because redacted is a container for a primitive data type, I would say if it works to use schema.redacted and then put the brand in there, that's what I would probably do. Now I gotta test my recommendation in the playground. It takes 10 minutes to load because I'm on my phone's internet. But 1 second.
Oh, okay. Now it expanded your recommendation there. So now it's all in a branding totalitarian code base. Cool. Yeah, and it's a good example, right? It's impossible to mix types. You can't incorrectly pass an email to a get user function or whatever. Otherwise, you could, and that would be sad. So yeah, it's more code, but once again, if this is all written by an LLM for you in a types file somewhere, who cares? And as long as you don't have to explain to the LLM every time the crazy pattern you want to try, do that. I guess I should probably recommend using tagged classes as well. But sorry.
Hang on 1 second. With user ID. I'm going to send you another playground.
Okay.
In a second. Oh gosh, no. My internet.
Oh no.
For the last 2 days, Comcast decided that they're just going to take down my internet for the entire day.
That's fine. They're cleaning it off.
It's like, it says, oh, improvements. I was like, it was fine before. Here. Where is the thread? Here. I put in the office hours thread the way I would do it if you wanted to brand something that's redacted.
Okay. All right. So yeah, it looks like yes. So branding the thing that's being redacted. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, because now when you access like redacted.value, you get the branded type out. So
yeah, that makes sense. And still, like you couldn't accidentally swap in a redacted branded value for a redacted branded value of a different type. So like the question is like what's the purpose? Like, what are you gaining from doing this? And the branding it gives you a nominality in a sense, or it prevents accidentally mixing up types.
Branding does introduce nominality, which is the one of the ways you can introduce nominality, but it really only works well for primitive types in TypeScript. Like you can also introduce nominality with tags, as you see, but the brand, like when you brand a type, it introduces a unique symbol to the type under the hood. So on the type level, that type is fully nominal and can never be inhabited by another type. But like tags, you could theoretically still have a situation where you have two types that have the identical structure. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, if I change user2's tag to be user, it's
correct.
happy.
So for like more structural types that aren't primitive types, like you have to be a little bit more careful, but for branded types, you do actually get like true nominality.
Okay, cool. Oh, and it looks like you don't. Okay, good. I was going to say it seems unfortunate that you have to pass in the same thing.
Yeah,
you don't.
For tagged class, if you don't pass in an ID, it uses the tag as the ID.
Good. Yeah, it looks like the LLM did that successfully in my example here. So goody. And now it's gone all in on brands. Thank you, Maxwell. You've uploaded your soul to the cloud. Now it exists here. So yeah, I'm not done with this yet. So I need to add more best practices or effect solutions. But yeah, that's kind of the idea of what this is going to be, and just to keep like the goals would be useful for humans to just quickly download into their brains what they should do. They just want to get something done with effect, and they want to do something that works and scales and is idiomatic to whatever degree we have idioms in TypeScript and in effect. And to form these idioms and to like ask these questions about really what does work well. Like one thing that I think in using services more and in writing some code bases more, I do feel like there is like this can inform a little bit of some stuff I'd like to propose for effect 4. Because in doing this, I was sketching out like an example code base and trying to extract implementations from that example code base and patterns that I found myself using. And I know we recommended last time, Maxwell, the effect.service constructor. But one downside with effect.service constructor that I ran into, despite liking a lot of it, is that you do have to provide that default implementation of the service. And it's great that it sort of infers the interface of the service from that default implementation. But when I was designing this example application, which was like a personal podcast generator, you give it a bunch of data sources, like, your email, your GitHub, your Twitter, whatever, and it would poll the last day or the next day, your calendar of information, ask an LLM to generate a script, and then send off that script to 11 Labs, some voice generator, and have it generate a personal podcast or whatever for your day. Total, I'm sure there's a million apps that do that, or you could just get ChatGPT to do it. But I thought it would be a fun example of, when it's done, a fun example code base, because it'll just be a bunch of services, and it sort of is a nice example of various effectful features. But when I was doing that, I wanted to first sketch out all of the interfaces. I didn't want to provide even a default implementation. I just wanted to think in terms of interfaces. Like when designing an application, it can be really nice just to think in terms of interfaces. And if you make a context.tag, it's really nice that you can actually, before I even have any implementations of this dependency, and I should make this some more. Let me see. For the some dependency example in the services and layers file, let's make this non-generic and come up with that should be a config probably instead of just some dependency. And my service can be like some other kind of service that uses a config. Come up with something simple. Okay, we'll see what it does. But anyway, so sorry, Maxwell.
Two things that I would say. I think you're right. I think that there are a lot of situations where context.tag is more flexible, or in 4.0 service map.key or service map.service. Sorry. I would say there are two things we probably want to include in these recommendations. One being that the identifier you pass to context.tag should be fully unique.
Yes.
So the effect language service actually, when you're, I think it does it for context.tag. I know it does it for effect.service.
Yeah.
But it'll actually use our recommendation of taking your package name and then the path to the file where you construct the service and then the service name. So basically, like if this was in, a project like Kit podcast app, it would generate a path like Kit podcast app /services / dependencies / some dependency, right? Hi, Mattia. And that just makes it's pretty impossible to have a duplicate in that situation, at least within the same app. So I would include that maybe as part of this example, and maybe a tiny context to why. It's just the key into the map. And then the other thing I would say is live as the static property. In 4.0, we're leaning very heavily away from this whole live and test terminology because we found that people find it confusing. What does live really mean? So we're actually just leaning on layer as the name to be very what's the word? explicit about what the thing is. So in this case, it would be like literally app-config.layer, app-config.test-layer, app-config.dev layer, whatever.
I love
So
it. That's so much better. That's much
yeah,
better.
these are just like tiny things that we've been thinking a lot about as we work on 4.0. And in 4.0, like I mentioned, this context term will be changed to service map to be, again, more explicit about like what the thing is. It's a map of services. And so you'd be doing like app config extends service map dot service. So you're creating the service app config that will go into the service map. So anyway, but yeah, those are just like two very small things I would point out here. So.
No, that's great. And yeah, this is exactly why, like, I think even making a document like this is good. Like, I always forget the rule of doing something wrong on the internet. It's not rule 43 or whatever. That's the other rule. There's the rule of being wrong on the internet. Hodgkin's law. There's too many laws. But whoever's law it is, yes, this kind of is that technique, to just put something out there, ensure that it will be wrong, and then get good recommendations. So, okay, amazing. I like that a lot. Let's see what it's done. Is it app.config, an app API client? Cool. Must be fully unique. Hey, look at this. It should probably even be more clear than this about exactly what to do. And it changed it to static read-only layer here. So this is a little more in line with what you're thinking?
Yeah, and I think, like, again, this is getting like super nitpicky, but like most of the services we're designing in 4.0 will be using a lowercase naming for the layers. So it'll be like app-config.lowercase layer.
I like it. Okay.
And the reason for
sense.
that is to separate the Pascal casing that we use for like service identifiers, like API client in this case, from like the layers that we're using to produce said services. So anyway, we're trying to give it like trying to make it like less confusing terminology, like very explicit what's going on. Hopefully over time, like this, it'll settle out that like people will find this terminology more straightforward than, you know, the whole, because like with effect, I mean, you've mentioned this tons of times before, Kit, like when you're learning effect, there's so many new things being thrown at you at the same time that like having to deal with the mental overhead of like learning what context does, then like mentally mapping the term context in your head to what it does. Like it's probably easier to have one less mental mapping overhead thingy that you have to do and just like be like, oh yeah, this is just like a service in my service map. Right? Like, I don't know.
I like it. I like it a lot. And yeah, I think the Pascal case for layer names, it just kind of made layers special when they're just values. So there's no point in having this weird special case. And calling them layers is great because live, etc. It's weird, and sometimes you might have multiple live layers. So it always felt to me, it gave me a little bit of a I don't know, OCD. My OCD hackles raised up a bit. It's like, but there's not just one live. There's this and that.
There's like another thing that we inherited from like the Zio ecosystem, and we're just like, I think that what's great about the JavaScript ecosystem is like, for better or for worse, probably for better, the developer community pushes always towards the lowest like overhead solution. It like pushes you as a library developer to like the lowest mental overhead solution. Like what API can you provide that's like the easiest to grok off the bat? And Effect already has so much mental overhead associated with it that this just seemed like one less thing. There's also a question in the chat, I don't know if you've got your chat pulled up, but about schema naming. Pascal case versus something else. I think in the Effect code bases and from companies that we've worked with, we tend to lean on just Pascal case with no schema suffix. Literally just Pascal case for data types. So like for your domain, that would be like our recommendation.
Cool. And yeah. I think I followed that in the examples here.
You
right?
sure did.
User
Yeah,
ID.
absolutely.
Okay, amazing. I had to add some more
Oh,
stuff here.
there's one more thing I forgot. I literally couldn't unmute myself before. I don't know why. But
Mhm.
if you go back to the TypeScript configs, this will be like one thing we could probably revisit down the line. But
Mhm.
the TypeScript configuration recommendations right now, this would only be relevant for a application that's not being bundled. Or is being bundled but is meant to be used as like a more of like a library-esque, because RTS config in the effect small repo is very much designed around it being a library, not
Okay,
around
cool.
like,
Yeah,
yeah. So
yeah.
like these settings, we can improve these settings over time, but just letting you know that that'll be a point of contention, I guess, amongst the crew.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, because there's also like instead of node next, there's like what is it?
Bundler.
Not infer or something. There's a bunch anyway. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I think for some of these as well, we'll want like right now there's only a few of these, so they're all at the top level. But I think there could be like a TypeScript config or a configuration subgrouping here, and then you can pick, right? A human can pick. Uh, like we don't have to shy away from nuance when there is real like nuance at the highest level. Like, yeah, that if you're writing a Vite of front end app, you probably might not want these settings, and then we should be very clear about which one to focus on. And then yeah, the LLM or the human can click on the one that's relevant to them. But what's so nice about, I think, just the fact that we most of the time, at least I do, use LLMs in the for the scaffolding of your project, which is a pretty boilerplate heavy process. And for me, like I'm mostly ignorant of it because it's TypeScript. And now as I learn like what I like, I'll say like, oh, use bun, use this, structure your thing like this, and then it does that. There's no point in having like a programmatic method, which is very brittle of generating these folder structures. Like because of all the like this is kind of the beauty of LLMs in general, right? They can somehow deal with the combinatorial complexity of for instance, self-driving. Like you could write a whole driving algorithm in C++ and it'll be 5 million lines of code and it'll break, or you can train a neural net and it'll just sort of work. So I don't know if repo scaffolding is exactly as complicated as self-driving, but it kind of is. And so they're really good at sort of just dealing with this combinatorial complexity explosion. And so it's just seeding it with enough information. I guess that's the goal of this guide here, or one
I
of the
like
goals.
it. I think like another thing we could add to this over time is like, we get questions a lot about like you mentioned it, but like literally folder structure, about like structuring services and things like that. Like how do we recommend you do that? And I think like the answer is we don't impose a file structure on you. This is like, but we could have like if you don't want to think about it, you could structure your app this way. But like we don't impose a particular structure or something. Like it's just it's a question that's come. I've answered myself at least like many times over the last few years, and I think like because you mentioned it earlier too, Kit. Like you said, effect is not so much a framework; it's a library that you use within other frameworks. So it's kind of like hard for us to be opinionated about like the structure of an app, so to speak.
Yeah,
But
yeah, but of course, no. I mean the beauty of just writing stuff for basically humans slash LLMs is that you can add qualifications and you can say, hey, if you're using if like your project has if your framework has a very strict folder structure, then follow that folder structure. But in a lot of times, like even with the next app, right, you have your source or lib folder, and then in there you can kind of do whatever. And maybe there are patterns and maybe there aren't. But yeah, if we can have a section for that, I think that makes sense. We can have a project structure section. Yeah, and when there are sort of like different subsets of apps like CLIs, etc., or mono repos, we can give recommendations in a very high level. But yeah, I think the overarching goal should be like be as concise as possible, and definitely prioritize what should be prioritized. I don't know. Don't try to cover literally everything, but yeah, I think at a high level it makes sense to address that. Like what I don't think it's worth. Like that is worth covering. Project structure comes up a lot. Like we should let the questions that naturally arise sort of guide what we address. But like, for instance, what we shouldn't address, I would argue, is like all of the nuances of schema, all the million ways of transforming types, or dealing with that, right? If we can link to the docs maybe in here, that would be cool. Like there could be a pointer to something. But at the same time, like the repo, I think the repo setup should have a recommendation to, I think I added it here. So Claude Code MCP setup. Do this. And also, here's a repository. And then clone the effect repo. And give it should probably say give a link to it. Like you can clone this in some open source folder and then just give the path to it, to your agent, and it can look into that. So when it needs help, it can just dive into the real thing to figure out all the methods for schema.
Yeah, I've been leaning on a getIgnored.context directory and just cloning every repo I want into there. And it works not just for effect, but like literally for any other language. Then you can just tell the LLM to...
And that would mostly be ignored by... Sometimes, like the agents ignore dot repositories is the only thing I've found is a problem sometimes. Is that a problem?
If you explicitly... I mean, I'm using open code right now, and if I tell it, like, hey, if you want to explore code bases, like, they'll be present in X directory, it does pretty well, and, like, sometimes I won't ignore, like, the parent directory, but I'll ignore everything underneath it, so that the directory exists in your code base. Like, because some people don't want to have submodules and subtrees, like, in their Git repository, which I totally understand. I've been through, like, the pain of submodules in my previous position. But if you want these projects to be available to the LLM, a nice way to do it is like that. You just give it a directory that's Git ignored. And so, as long as you, like, explicitly tell the thing that it's in there, usually it will search there. I don't know.
Okay, no, that's amazing. Yeah, and it sounds like as people are creating slash commands for this, I think that's great, and that has been one of the best. A couple things I think have made a huge difference in the effectiveness of these LLMs. Well, one is that they keep getting better, it seems, so that's helpful. But yeah, the idea of just giving it paths to the full repositories is so much better than it sort of trying to. It's not great at searching the web for. Like if you wanted to look at a code base and really figure out how something works, web searches aren't great. If you wanted to find blog posts that might describe a solution, that's a good first step, and then it can clone whatever it finds and then work from there. That seems to work really well. But yeah, web searching is also really good lately. Codex as well I think you have to have a flag for it, but you can enable web searching, and that's really good at finding documentation and whatnot. But yeah, let me see if there's anything else worth covering here. We probably, because there is the meetup tonight, I do need to polish this off and work on it some more at some point today before that. But I want to think of, just to recap, the idea is to have this high-level guide, just to, if you actually want to start writing code, if you're like a company using effect, the goal would be, this would be incredibly useful to give each of your engineers and to solve the problems of a single source of truth and like this sort of getting out of date. There's a cron job in the repository, which I'll open source probably tonight. That will, when there is a source of truth, it'll look at the source of truth, compare it, open issues. That'll have false positives probably and false negatives, but I think it should at least, work most of the time, because that's an inherent problem with documentation in general. And this is going to be focused enough that I hope it's tractable. And then getting this documentation into the LLM is the next challenge. And so like for Claude Code, there's the skill thing, which seems to be useful, where you can package everything up. And so there's a CLI, like bunx, once again, bunx, what is it? Effect solutions. And it'll be a CLI that will install the skill. But it can also maybe be a CLI that just adds a repo, like for codex or for open code, whatever that would do best with. Just that makes it an effect solutions subfolder and tells your LLM. Like you can just, ideally, it's probably to the point where you can just tell your LLM, open up your favorite LLM and say, hey, call bunx effect solutions -- help, and then help set it up for me. And then the LLM can take a look at the CLI help docs, which should mention, hey, if you're Claude Code, install a skill. If you're not Claude Code, I don't know, do whatever you like to do. Search the web. Like you can sort of this makes the boundaries between interfaces. LLMs make the boundaries between interfaces so much more fluid, for good and for bad. They're going to be much more forgiving. They're also not going to behave deterministically. But I think we should try to figure out the best way to lean into that. And at the end of the day, all of these different tools and formats and MCP servers are just ways of like giving text to LLMs. So just like dumping text, dumping a repo with some structure into a project is probably going to always work really well. And anything else is like a super like micro optimization, and no one adopts it. So it's not even really worth, like they deprecated sub agents or something and then they brought them back. It's all silliness. I've never really used any of that. I've not had the need to, because it's just like a slash command or something you copy paste tends to work just as well. It's literally what it turns into anyway, with some whatever other details. Okay, I think I'm done rambling. Maybe there's one question. Shit. I forgot to go back to it. There's one question. Let me see if this is something we can answer today, or maybe we should answer next time. Okay, let me just read it out loud. One thing that I've been asking about here is the incremental adoption story for effect in an existing TRPC API, specifically for crossing the boundary of effect back to async await and returning results over the wire. I came up with an example of how I do this in my project, but I've seen others take different approaches too. Let me copy this link. Would be cool if there are any effectful best practices there who can't quite adopt effect across the whole stack yet. So, add a lesson for incremental adoption of effect. Duh. That would be a great one to have.
I almost feel like that could be part of the beginner course, because the incremental adoption story is nuanced in this. I mean, you could definitely put it in like the solutions thingy too, but there's like some nuance as to like the path you take. But
yeah. I haven't even started the course. Well, I've kind of started the course, but I'll have to think about how to approach that there. I'd imagine we can have like sort of similar to like the TypeScript config. We'll be sort of forking like a subfolder with different options. You can have a subfolder with different options. Like I think at least focusing on the high level, like here's how you might want to run it to a promise or something. But of course, there's details like how do you propagate telemetry spans, or how do you propagate these things? Maybe that's more for the also like the main docs or the JS docs. I don't know where we make that boundary of like, okay, now you're doing something pretty rare. But nonetheless, it's a good problem. Yes, maybe we could look at this next week, unless you have any, Maxwell. Like,
I was just scrolling through the TRPC stuff. It looks reasonably good. I'm not like a super familiar with TRPC as like a library. I have just enough context on the library to know like some stuff. But like I just scrolled through this. It looks like a pretty reasonable approach in my opinion. But yeah, maybe next week we can have Matt on and just like talk about this.
Yeah, at a high level, generally, yeah, you're going to run your effect probably to a promise, as that's sort of the piping that every other library in the world of TypeScript expects. And you might need to propagate certain things and translate errors.
Yeah, you could even expose, since you have the runtime on the context here, you could just have a context.run effect, I think. I don't know if context has to be like a particular thing, but like if you have the runtime there already, you can just construct run methods from that runtime and expose that through the context. So
okay, cool. Yeah, sounds like.
But anyway, we have to head out because we've got a lot of prep to do before we both head into the city this evening. But thank you all very much for joining. Thank you, Kit, for hosting again.
Yeah, thank you. I hope that was so interesting. If you have any thoughts about this or things you want us to cover, well, it'll be open sourced soon and open to issues and discussions, and also in the chat or here. So yeah, see y'all next week. And if anyone's going to be in New York, see you in New York later. I think it'll be recorded, maybe not, but hope to see you all at some Effect meetup sometime in the future.
Bye, everybody. Cheers, everybody.